Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Just setting up. We'll be starting momentarily. Just bear with me. Sinking feeling. Is it... Just bear with me. It's still getting set up. Let me know as well if there's any problems with the feed. The internet here is still pretty wonky, so I can't guarantee how well this is going to go. But so far, I believe so good. So there we go. Okay, so good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's episode of the Paranormal Encyclopedia. If anybody missed it on Facebook, I do apologize for the fact we didn't have an episode last week. If you guys aren't following me there already, I suggest you go look up the Paranormal Encyclopedia on Facebook and add it. Updates and things that are going on, particularly if the show's got to be postponed like it had to be last week, you'll find them on there. For those of you who don't know, unfortunately last week we had an issue with the internet here, so unfortunately I wasn't able to do the show. So far, so good on this week. Hopefully, the internet will bear with me. But we're going. Tonight, we're going to talk about one of my favorite writers. And he's a really interesting writer, at least where the paranormal is concerned, because so many people associate him with magic and the paranormal, but there's really no reason to. The writer, of course, would be Howard Philip Lovecraft. He's also known, of course, as H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a very colorful fellow who lived in the early 1900s. Let me look up, I'll get exact dates. For those of you who... I'm assuming most of you know at least the basics of who he is and what he wrote. If you don't, go to the Halloween episode. I read one of his very fine stories, The Rats Within the Walls, which was one of my first stories, and it's also one of my favorites. Actually, in fact, it's my very first story of his. So he was born August 20th, 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, and he died March 15th, 1937, also in Providence, Rhode Island. He lived his entire life in the New England area. I mean, he did actually live in New York for a while, not always in Providence. And what's most people know about him, what he's sort of famous for, is he was kind of a social recluse. But he kept a huge circle of friends that he wrote with, including a number of very important writers that would come later. Like, he was a good friend and a bit of a mentor to Robert Bloch, the man who wrote the Psycho novels. He was a friend to Robert E. Howard, the guy who wrote Conan the Barbarian. And if you read, there are Lovecraftian elements in some of the Conan stories and in some of the stories of Solomon Kane, which is one of Howard's other characters. There's some references to Howard and Lovecraft. August Derleth was another very important one who wasn't as well known. But he has a circle of friends that he kept in correspondence with. Some he was a mentor to, some he was friends with. He had a good relationship with Algernon Blackwood, who was another very important writer at the time. And the thing is, Lovecraft isn't incredibly well known. There's been a handful of mostly bad movies based on his stuff, and a few good ones. There's an excellent black and white version of The Call of Cthulhu by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. I believe it's available on YouTube. Whisper on the Darkness, which is another excellent story of his. They also did a silent version of that, or excuse me, a black and white but not silent. Cthulhu was silent and stop motion, but they stylistically chose to just do it in black and white for the second movie. And he influenced everybody in horror and fantasy. He was a big influence on Stephen King. He was a big influence on Neil Gaiman, Clive Barker, Dean Koontz. Just about everyone in the modern horror genre grew up reading Lovecraft stories in the Weird Tales magazines, which is where they were usually published. Much like his own idol, Edgar Allan Poe, he wasn't a financial success in his own lifetime. Although, unlike Poe, Lovecraft hasn't really gained the fame after his death. There are, of course, elements that he created that are definitely very prominent. I mean, Cthulhu's nearly a household name these days, thanks to the plushies and the various board games. The Necronomicon is extremely well known. Ironically enough, that's going to be a large part of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But the thing with Lovecraft himself is people speculate that he was some type of magician or occultist, that he secretly was in communication with spiritual beings that fed him all of this information. It's a Lord of Horse manure. Lovecraft himself, if you read his letters that he wrote to his friends, and they've actually been published, but he was very dismissive of the occult and the paranormal. He clearly didn't believe in it. In point of fact, he was actually a very good friend of the famed magician Harry Houdini. And on Houdini's behalf, he wrote an article on astrology, specifically discounting it. And then he was working on a book very late in his career called The Cancer of Superstition, which was ghostwriting for Houdini about the paranormal in general and magic and all these other phenomena that were going on in the world at the time. Trying to expand outward from a magician among the spirits. And unfortunately, it was basically killed by the fact that Houdini died. Sadly, the only thing that still exists on the subject is a single, is an outline and I think a couple of chapters. But yeah, the idea that he was in any way an occultist has no basis in reality. There's only, in fact, one of his stories that involves any kind of real-world magical ritual, which is the horror Red Hook. And ironically enough, basically he went to his friend Algernon Blackwood, and he wanted to learn a little bit about the occult to incorporate it in his stories. Blackwood, who was himself an occultist, suggested to him a number of books on the subject he could read, and he didn't particularly care for it. He thought the whole thing was sort of silly, and the spell that he does use a single spell in the story, and a bit of magic in a few of his other later stories. What makes this all funny is the spell that he uses to summon the Eldritch Horror is in fact a blessing ritual. So, yeah, this idea that he was some knowingly some sort of occultist has no real basis. There's nothing that he said, there's nothing that he did that implied it. The closest link I know of, and it is a fairly interesting link, is his wife, Sonia Green, who actually at least had met, while they were in New York, had met Aleister Crowley, the most, one of the most infamous magicians of all time. Um, they weren't necessarily good friends, but she did at least meet him a few times, had interacted with him, knew him. So there's some speculation that Lovecraft may have met Crowley, but there's no hard evidence. Certainly, there's nothing in his writings, either his stories or his private letters, that would suggest it. The closest I've ever found to a quote saying that he believed in any of this was that at one point he called himself a pagan, which is true. But, yeah. He did say that he didn't really mean that he considered himself that. Like a pagan in the sense of the word. He was, by all evidence, an atheist. Hold on. Just trying to find quotes. I get a lot of the information that comes up from all of this comes from the infamous book that's commonly referred to as the Simon Necronomicon. It's the black one you find in the stores all of the time. And we're gonna get into that because it's rather relevant to the whole thing, because people think that this book, the Necronomicon, exists and that it's one of the great books of black magic. It's pretty much a load of nonsense, as we'll get into. There's a quote, yes, but there's a quote that was attributed to Lovecraft from August Derleth, who was his literary executor, in the novel, in the introduction to the book Dunwich Horror and Others, where supposedly Lovecraft wrote, "All my stories, unconnected as they may be, are based on the fundamental lore legend that this world was inhabited at one time by another race who, in practicing black magic, lost the foothold and were expelled to live on the outside, ever ready to take possession of this earth again." The thing is, Lovecraft never said it. It came from a guy by the name of Harold Furness, who was briefly a correspondent of Lovecraft's. But the reality is, no, he didn't believe in this kind of thing. He was generally very dismissive. Let me see. There's quotes about. Of anything relating to the paranormal. He used it in his stories, certainly. They're full of monsters and semi-demonic beings. We're going to get into that as well. Here we go. We found a lot of quotes from him. But he was an atheist. As far as we know, he was an atheist. He was also very much sort of nihilistic. There's a quote from his collected essays: "It's good to be a cynic. It is better to be a contented cat, and it is best not to exist at all." Um, and it's interesting enough. And here's another good quote relating to religion. Religion is still useful among the herd, that it keeps their orderly conduct as nothing else could. The crude human animal is ineradicably superstitious, and there is every biological reason why they should be. Take away this Christian God and saints, and he will worship something else. So he wasn't a believer in religion. It didn't necessarily mean that he himself practiced it. He just saw it as something useful for keeping things organized. Okay, so let's, instead of digging through various quotes, you can look up online. There's ample quotes on Lovecraft on a wide range of subjects if you're interested. He wrote various essays as well as his many novels, and he wrote volumes of letters that are all available. But let's talk a little for a second about the mythology that's grown up around him. And before I get into this, the folks I can see there are a couple of you watching out there. Could you let me know that if everything's okay in the feed? Just again, I'm worried about the internet issues I've been having over the last several weeks. Hopefully this isn't a completely jumbled mess. But meanwhile, so the thing is, Lovecraft wrote in several of his stories. The first one it was The Hound, about the Necronomicon. The Necronomicon was supposedly a book of magic, and it was supposed to be the ultimate book of magic. There have, of course, been numerous people that have written their own Necronomicon. The most famous, of course, being the Simon Necronomicon, which is a black one with a weird circular symbol on the cover that you can find in most bookstores and on Amazon. If you look up Necronomicon on Amazon, that's probably going to be the first one. If you have a copy of it at home, it's probably this. It's a little very thin paperback book. It's actually pretty short. What the word Necronomicon, what's interesting is what Necronomicon means, the name. So the Necronomicon, yes, first time it shows up is in 1924 in the story The Hound, although it was written in 1922. And it's mentioned frequently through his work. It's mentioned through his friends, his collaborators. It's mentioned over and over again. And there's many jokes out there. There are a number of libraries that will put, especially in the old days when you had the actual physical card catalogs, there'd be a card for the Necronomicon. But whenever anybody tried to check it out, it's always out, usually under the name of Lovecraft or something to that effect. Apparently there was even one in the Yale University Library. It's card catalog. And a number of again, there are a number of ones out there. There's a Simon Necronomicon. There is another book. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. There's H.R. Geiger's Necronomicon, which is actually not meant to be the real Necronomicon. It's a collection of art. There is a very recent one that just came out. The name I'm trying to think of. Or more, I'm trying to think of the guy who wrote it. Donald Tyson. That's who I'm trying to think of. Tyson tried to stick very close to what Lovecraft wrote, and what's really critical about Tyson's Necronomicon versus the Simon Necronomicon, or the millions of other hoaxes that are out there, is that Tyson was outright honest. No, this is fictional. I'm just, he was creating it as a fictional work. He wasn't claiming it was a real book with real magic. And he also has since published a book called All Is Ed, which is the fictional life of the author of the Necronomicon. George Hay did one that showed up in 1978 that actually had an introduction from a well-known paranormal investigator by the name of Colin Wilson. And supposedly it came from a text by Dr. John Dee, which in fairness is one of the people Lovecraft connected it to in his stories. There's a guy, but one of my favorite theories, there's a guy by the name of Robert Turner. Supposedly Robert Turner translated it was truer. The Lovecraftian version, the Simon text, had quotes from Lovecraft stories and passages. Wilson apparently also wrote a story called The Return of Lilligor. L-L-O Lilligor. Here's the thing. You'll listen to me pronounce things like Cthulhu, Lilligor, and various other Lovecraftian beasties tonight. And you may, or when I do readings, because I am going to get to that, I promise. And it's like, wait, that's not how you pronounce that. The thing with Lovecraft's creatures is Lovecraft was always never agreed. Lovecraft never agreed between two writings on how you pronounce these names. In fact, if you look at it, he claimed that these names were the closest human approximations of sounds the human mouth cannot make. So, no, there isn't a single correct pronunciation. There isn't even a single correct spelling. Hence, you'll see, CTHULHU, CTHULU, and about a million other ones. And the thing is, you could go, oh, well, Lovecraft spelled it this way, or said it was supposed to be pronounced this way. Yeah, you could do that. There's at least 4 or 5 other ways that Lovecraft spelled the word. So it's hard to go, oh, this is the one true way, because he didn't agree to it. But, okay, so let's talk a little about the Necronomicon. So Lovecraft uses it in many of his stories. Usually it was a book of black magic. It was something used to summon up these monstrous beings, or used by wizards to do horrible things. But the thing, and then there's also a few stories that use it in a more positive light. The rituals that are used in the story, the Dunwich Horror, to drive off the horror, come out in the Necronomicon. Again, here's the thing. There's a lot of people, there's a couple of websites, and I've had issues with them in the past, because they don't particularly like when I say these things. Hey, Lord Ruin, yes, and as Lord Ruin has said, Lovecraft's creatures' names were supposedly unpronounceable by humans, which is what I'm getting at. But, so there are all these people that insist, no, the Necronomicon really exists. The Simon one is supposedly the real one, and there's a whole book that came out recently, The History of the Necronomicon, giving this elaborate story of how supposedly it came into being. Here's the thing. There is absolutely no record of any book called the Necronomicon or the Al-Azif, or anything resembling those names, prior to 1924. Prior to when Lovecraft himself wrote it in one of his stories. And Lovecraft himself made a comment on the Necronomicon. I just saw this. He didn't think much of it. He considered... people asked him in his own lifetime to write his own version of the book. He refused to do it. And he refused to do it specifically because he felt that any copy that somebody actually wrote wouldn't live up to the hype. It's supposed to be this ultimate book of black magic that opens doors to other universes and could end the world. There's nothing... Yeah, here we go. He once wrote that if anyone were to try to write the Necronomicon, it would disappoint those who have shuddered at cryptic references to it. Where's that from? It's a letter to Jim Blish and William Miller Jr., quoted put it in the afterword to Joshi that he said that. He did not want somebody to capitalize on to try to write this book. He didn't want to write it himself. Not because he thought it was this terrible thing that could end the world, because he thought the fear of this unknown thing that you only ever see glimpses of and quotes from, that's so forbidden and terrible, was more effective than anything anyone was ever going to come up with. Now here's the kicker. Here is the absolute kicker of the whole thing. The Simon Necronomicon is absolutely not the real Necronomicon. There is no evidence anywhere to support this. And yeah, Simon or whoever it is that wrote the book and write as many books inventing colorful stories as they want. But unless somebody can produce to me a physical copy of the Necronomicon that can be carbon dated prior to 1924 for a start, or otherwise proven to be that older than Lovecraft's first mention of it, not just translation, an actual physical copy, yeah, I'll pass. And, oh no. Is it working? Guys, give me some... Lord Ruin, somebody give me some feedback. Because at the moment, it's not showing that it's working very well on my end. Come on, somebody give me some sign of how the stream's doing. Okay, is it choppy or anything? Anyway, it's going. You guys may have some issues with how quickly it's. Oh, now it says the stream's offline. Okay, it seems to be working again for the time being. So continuing. So one of the few remotely legitimate arguments supporters of the Simon Necronomicon will make that it's real is, well, the magic works. Yeah, it should start up again in a second. The internet's really not working well tonight. I'm going to probably make this a short episode just by virtue of this is what's going on. I had wanted to go longer. I think really hate to say this, but I think I'm going to have to go back to doing pre-recorded episodes just because the internet is not cooperating. At least until the internet comes back and is working a little better, we're going to have to go with pre-recordeds just because then you're going to get at least a coherent episode instead of this choppy mess that we're getting right now. I'm going to try and finish at least because I don't want to leave a half full episode, as it were. So anyway, I'll probably go at least finish the thought with the Necronomicon, and I may come back. I'll probably come back to this as a larger topic because I did want to talk about Lovecraft's worldview because I think it's fairly interesting. So anyway, people will argue that the Simon Necronomicon, maybe some of the other ones, work, that you can summon spirits up with them. Yeah, well, okay, I believe that. There's a whole branch of magic that's become popular in recent years they call chaos magic. I am not an occultist or magician by any means. I'm a demonologist. But as I understand it from reading the Book of Lies, which is a book about chaos magic, and similar works on the subject, chaos magic has a lot more to do with the symbolism and believing that certain symbols can work with magic even if they don't objectively speaking exist. For example, there's supposedly branches of chaos magicians that work with various superheroes because they're iconic images. Whether or not Superman ever exists or not, he's an iconic image. There's belief about. There's enough ideas and enough belief at least in Superman as a symbol, if not as an actual objective being, out there to tap into. And I am probably muddling this terribly because, again, I don't know a whole lot about chaos magic. From what I know about it, it seems interesting enough. I may have to see if I can run down the chaos. Somebody in the chaos magic community that'd be interesting in coming on the show to talk about it, because I think it is a really interesting subject. But anyway, there are chaos magicians that work with Lovecraftian creatures, but they're not arguing that they're real. Again, it's this reality of the symbols and the archetypes matter more than the objective reality. And here's the other thing: there's two concepts I think you're running into here. One we talked about before. It's called the tulpa, or in Western magic, it's called an egregore. This idea that belief and thought and interest can spawn something that exists on its own. Lovable good people cannot use chaos magic. Yeah, they really shouldn't. Law chaos, it doesn't fit. But so by that train of thought, Cthulhu may exist on some level simply because so many people believe he exists. The Necronomicon may work simply. Magic depends very heavily on faith and belief, so it may work just because people think it's going to work. On the other hand, there's a simpler explanation than that, in my opinion, which is the thing people often don't understand is it's not rocket science summoning up a demon. They're sitting around smoking brimstone, as it were, waiting for somebody to give them an invitation. So getting one to show up is actually pretty easy. And as a rule, demons don't use their true names with mortals because true names give power. So I'm of the opinion that, there's plenty of demons out there that if you want to call them Cthulhu, will show up with tentacles and bat wings and call themselves Cthulhu. There are demons out there that will call themselves Hashur. And that's a joke for my gamer friends, because Hashur is supposed to be kind of like Beetlejuice. You say it 3 times and he'll appear, but you say it 3 times again and he won't appear. So, and Shub-Niggurath and all of these other beings, do they really exist? I don't think so. But is there a spirit out there somewhere that is happy enough to show up looking like calling itself that? If you call loudly enough, yeah, I think there are. It's not, summoning up, getting a spirit to show up is not a difficult process. People do it by accident all the time. Getting anyone to show up and do what you want it to is another matter, and getting it to go away is even harder. In fact, if you read the Simon Necronomicon, it warns you not to be very careful with it, because the things that it summons up can never be sent back. Aside from the fact that's utter hogwash, that should give you an idea of, how does this work so well if you can't send it back? If I get enough people to believe my ex-girlfriend will get back together with me, will she? Possibly. I'm not making any promises, but if you get enough people to believe it, maybe. And there's some really interesting things that somebody who knew more about the subject than I could say about the nature of belief and the way that it may or may not influence quantum mechanics, just by virtue of the universe is much weirder than we think, than any of us give it credit for, even people like me. But yeah, so again, does the Necronomicon objectively exist? Yeah, well, there are hoaxes that go by that name, and there are hoaxes that certainly will help you work black magic if you want to work if you're dumb enough to want to do that. Did it exist before Lovecraft invented it? There is no rational basis to make that conclusion anywhere. The books, the Simon, and I pick on it a lot because it is the most well-known version that openly claims to be the real thing. I mean, Tyson's has become pretty popular lately, but it's not going to replace the Simonism when everybody thinks of, when they think of the Necronomicon. but it mixes Sumerian mythology, Babylonian mythology, a little Christian theology, and a bunch of Lovecraftian stuff, and a whole bunch more made up in ridiculous ways that show a lack of understanding of even Babylonian or Sumerian mythology and magic. If you want to read an excellent book on this subject, I would recommend the book, The Necronomicon Files, which is a combination of a historian and a magician tackling this idea that the Necronomicon exists and tearing it a new one for all intents and purposes. Let me take a look. He wrote Daniel Harms is a writer, author, and librarian in upstate New York. He wrote it with John Wisdom Gantz III. I'm not a huge fan. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of everything it has to say. Frankly, I think it gets a little out there when it comes to the magical side of it. And yes, Lord, I think you're more likely to get a restraining order from your ex-girlfriend if you get people believing you're going to get back together than actually make it work. You'd have to consult a magician to be certain, but my best guess is you're going to go into restraining order territory there. And I don't advise it. Not to mention, how many people would you need to get to believe it, I wonder? And for a more demented person than me, this could be an interesting experiment. So, Lord Owen asked, did Lou and I ever have to deal with people who thought they could summon Lovecraftian horrors? No, I never have had to deal with it, nor to my knowledge had Lou. It used to be one of the questions we'd ask guests on the show, what they thought of the Necronomicon just as a BS test. The ones who were convinced it was real are usually full of it. I will say this, I do have a friend who had to deal with the Simon Necronomicon at one point. In kicking a bunch of demons out of the house that somebody was stupid enough to summon with a book. For that matter, aside from the fact that Cthulhu and Hester and the other ones don't exist, I believe there are a few actual demons mentioned in the book at various places, given it includes a bit of Sumerian and Babylonian mythology. And I'm not going to go so far as to say Sumerian, Babylon were all demon, a bunch of demon worshippers, but they did definitely believe in demons. And on the other hand, they actually did. That's an interesting subject of itself, but the short version is that there are demons within Babylonian culture that they actually did pray to. Pazuzu would be a prominent example, and the reason Pazuzu was a demon, semi-divine figure associated with disease and death and decay, but you'd wind up doing rituals to him to protect your children from his wife, Lamatsu. Lamatsu being one of the few demonic beings that, no, there really are no redeeming qualities, not many, if any, redeeming qualities to her. So it's like there are other Babylonian deities that aren't quite so dark. Marduk being their chief god and the god of the city. I want to beat down one of the most Lovecraftian beings in folklore, which would be Tiamat, who is not a five-headed dragon, despite what certain cartoons depict her as. Dragon-like and serpents, but more creature of primordial darkness. So the thing with Lovecraft, now that we've addressed the Necronomicon, what's interesting about his stories, and I think, well, I don't agree with him in all respects. I think he actually has a legitimate point, at least in one regard, is a lot of his the only really arguably the only really directly malevolent being in Lovecraft's stories is not Nyarlathotep. and I'll get back to him in a second. Most of the other ones, arguably, it's not that they're evil per se, it's more that when you're dealing with a being like, particularly like Azathoth is the roiling chaos at the center of all things. Um, it doesn't have an intelligence that you can meaningfully have an interaction with. Um, Cthulhu is a massive, ancient, alien being, and it is an alien. He came from another world, with an incredibly advanced. There's kind of a concept in Lovecraft that what we think of as magic is actually science. It just it's Arthur C. Clarke's third law that any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. Cthulhu and these others have such a deep, complex understanding of the universe. It seems like they have magical powers. And the thing of it is, it's kind of this idea that when you have something so big and so vast and so ancient, it doesn't relate to people. It doesn't. It can't look at you and recognize. To a Lovecraftian deity, humans are ants. Oh, I stepped on something. Let me peel it off of my foot. They're on such a completely different level from us. They can't appreciate that we matter in any meaningful way, which is very much a core concept within Lovecraft's stories. The universe just doesn't care. It's probably the most clear-cut example of his atheism. That in all of his stories, the overwhelming point is that mankind is ultimately meaningless. That what greater forces exist in the universe are unthinking, uncaring. We're not necessarily alone, because there are many alien creatures even within our own solar system and on our own planet. But if they care, insofar as they take any interest in the Migo, the fungi from Yolgoth, are a good example of this. We're a chemistry experiment to them. There's something to play. We're something to use. There's something to play with. The other things may very well have, which is another creature from his many works, may have created mankind as a science experiment. That's what we are to these beings. As Lord Ruin puts it, Lovecraftian gods like Cthulhu see us as insignificant things, kind of like we see insects or toys. I think a lot of them don't even see us as playthings. They just see us as insects. It's something you step on. Occasionally we're uppity insects, but that's about it. The one interesting exception to all of this is the Man of 1,000 Faces, Nyarlathotep, who's a really neat character. I think I'll actually wind up reading the story Nyarlathotep in the near future, because it's relatively short and it's a pretty cool story about this Nikola Tesla-esque figure who travels around and convinces people to follow him and does these disturbing and terrifying experiments and shows these bizarre and terrifying films. I'll read the story. It's a good story. But Nyarlathotep is supposed to have been, there's a figure mentioned in European witch folklore called the Black Man. And it's not a black man in an African American sense. It's a guy with pitch black, absolute black skin and Caucasian features, who would appear at the Sabbath, and he carried this book, and the witches would sign their name in the book, and he's supposed to be the devil. And that, according to Lovecraft, is Nyarlathotep. Nyarlathotep is the messenger of the greatest of Lovecraftian's deities, the outer gods, which would be your Azathoth, the roiling chaos at the center of all things, Yog-Sothoth, the gateway and the key presumably between other dimensions. And to some extent, he's these beings' soul, these beings' personality. Because the thing is, as I was saying, is particularly when you get into Azathoth, Azathoth is this broiling cloud of chaos that is at the center of the universe. It's constantly spawning new things. Um, but it's an idiot. It's a blind idiot. It has no relationship to the universe around us. It is essentially the creator, but the creator doesn't care. Um, and there's this piping of music that's constantly listening to. Um, but it's a good example of his worldview that they just don't care. They don't, and it's not even capable of caring because it doesn't have a personality in any sense as we recognize it. It's more of a force of nature than a god, as it were. Um, the closest beings on this level have to a personality is Nyarlathotep, Hotep, who actually, and there's all sorts of stories in Lovecraft about him, about how he was a pharaoh in ancient Egypt. He supposedly has many, 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 many different faces. And I encourage you guys to go read some Lovecraft. He is a quite good writer, even if he has his failings. He's certainly very racist, but he's an enjoyable writer. There's many other stories out there, there's endless stories inspired by him. You can look up, for example, my friend Patrick Thomas, we've had on the show, who has had a long running and wonderful advice column called Dear Cthulhu. Good advice for bad people. I definitely recommend checking it out. Yeah, and Lord Owen comments that Lovecraft got the idea from Nyarlathotep from a nightmare he had. He's supposed to be a prophet and a scientist, but the knowledge he shows and gives to people is supposed to be so profound and dramatic pause. But yeah, that's true too. Lovecraft had a lot of vivid dreams over the course of his life. That heavily influenced his writing. In fact, if you look, a lot of horror writer. There's the rest of the quote. What Lord Rue was saying is so profound and horrifying that people go insane simply because their minds cannot comprehend it, which is what I was getting to. The story of Nyarlathotep. Lovecraft did have a dream that inspired Nyarlathotep, and creatures that show up in the stories called the Night Gaunts were also inspired by a dream they found particularly horrific as a child, and it was a recurring nightmare at that. There's also some speculation that Nyarlathotep was inspired by Nikola Tesla because Tesla traveled around doing strange science experiments, much like Nyarlathotep does. And Tesla is a lot of fun. Is an enormous amount of fun. Very off topic, but if you're like one of the three people that are listening to this who don't know who Nikola Tesla is, I highly recommend you look him up. The shortest version I can give you on who Nikola Tesla was is think of how your history class told you how awesome Thomas Edison was. That's not Ted Edison. Edison was not a great inventor. Tesla was. In reality, Thomas Edison was a great showman. And he was absolutely brilliant at marketing, but he wasn't really much of an inventor. Most of the things we give him credit for were done by people working for him. Some of them were even done by Tesla. And one of the most fundamental... Okay, I'm going to sidetrack a little, but I like Tesla. One of the most fundamental things Tesla's responsible for is electricity. We all give alternating current and AC and DC, because I don't remember exactly what they stand for. The one we all use was created by Nikola Tesla. The other one that isn't widely used was Thomas Edison's work. And it was and the battle between them is fascinating, and it actually led to Edison electrocuting an elephant to prove his point. Along with much shadier things, but again, we're getting way off topic because Tesla's, despite some of the connections in fiction lately, isn't paranormal. Edison, the short version is Edison was a jerk and a great marketer. Tesla was a genius inventor. Um, yeah, he AC alternating current was Tesla. DC was Edison, and yeah, the DC was never as good a solution to power as AC, which is why we widely use AC. Yeah. But Edison was pretty much in common jerk. Another point Lord Ruin makes, it's a little off topic, but it is interesting to mention, is that in Lord Ruin's opinion, I disagree. The best thing about Lovecraft was that he loves cats. Cats are actually protected by some Lovecraftian gods. It's true that Lovecraft had a great fondness for cats. There's a whole book called there's a whole story which he wrote where a whole town gets destroyed because they were cruel to cats. Um, I don't particularly like cats personally, so I wouldn't call that the best thing about Lovecraft. But if you like cats, yeah, he has a whole bunch of stories. I will say on the subject of Lovecraft and dreams, some of his most interesting stories, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of others, were actually not horror so much as dark fantasy. One of his longest and best known, in fact, they even turned it into an animated movie not that long ago, would be the Dream Quest to Unknown Kadath. Um, and these actually take place in the dream world, in this idea of a shared consciousness where everyone visits to some greater or lesser extent the dreamlands when they sleep. And some people get good, particularly his often hero and very much his stand-in in his stories, Randolph Carter. You can visit it, you can control it to varying degrees. Great people, great dreamers, when they die, actually got the ability to move there forever as their sort of afterlife. But he had this incredible sweeping idea of a world built out of dreams. There's a book out there called The Dream Cycle of H.P. Lovecraft that contains a number of the stories. And again, like I said, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is pretty much the best known of them and is quite long. It's basically a novella. Otherwise, I'd probably read it on here at some point because it is probably my favorite Lovecraft story. Um, just because of how wide sweeping it is and how grandiose. Um, but okay, we're coming up on an hour. I did want to make tonight a little longer, but I think given the connection problems that we're having again tonight, I'm gonna cut it short now. As I said, I think at this point, for the time being, I'm going to move to pre-recorded episodes, just because I'm not real pleased with the connectivity problems. It's going okay right now. It may not be in in 10 minutes. I have no way of knowing. Um, but yeah, that's Lovecraft and the occult. Like I said, he's not really an occult figure. People just think he is. A lot of people think he is. I don't know why. But if you've enjoyed this, please like, comment, subscribe. Please, if you can, go back and watch my other videos if you haven't seen them yet. This is the 55th episode I've done so far, and that's not counting the Forgotten Fairy Tale segments. There's 7 of those, so there's 62 main episodes between the two shows and a bunch of bonuses and other neat things out there. Um, I am trying to keep this going long term. I would love to eventually turn this into a full-time gig, but I still have to work at the moment, so that's why you don't get quite as much content as you might. Um, if you can, please feel free to support me. There should be I'll put in a link to the Patreon. I will definitely say as well, if you have ad blocker, I would ask when you watch the old episodes, please turn it off. I do get some revenue from those ads. I hate watching them too, but it still helps a lot. We will be back next week. I'll have something up next Sunday. I'm going to try and get some stuff up in the meantime with fairy tales. I'm looking at doing the story of Sun Wukong maybe recording it in the next day or two and get it up. I'm gonna try and get something up on Sunday. So Lord Ruin says, and it's true, that some of his Lovecraft's God was okay. We're real quick. I'll get into this, but some of Lovecraft's gods were shaped by his racism. Intriguingly, Lord Ruin says that he later felt bad about that. I'm a little surprised. I knew there's some overwhelming racism in some of his stories. But apparently Shub Niggurath was supposed to be a play on the N-word, which to my embarrassment I used a couple of times in the Halloween episode just because I was quoting the story and it's used several times, and I don't believe in politically correcting old stories. But yeah, Lovecraft was a racist. You can see varying degrees of it in many of his stories. I'm not going to try and justify it. He was a racist. He was at times a raging racist. But the reality of the situation was this was someone living in New England from a rich family that had fallen on hard times in the 1920s and the 1930s. Racism wasn't the exception at the time, unfortunately. It was pretty much the norm. First time, location, and social standing. That doesn't make it okay, nor am I justifying it. Just the realities of... You'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of writers at the time that weren't, to varying degrees. But okay, I do think that wraps us up for tonight. I am sorry to cut it short, although if an hour qualifies as short, I'm not certain. Or just about an hour. But like I said, the stream is going in and out. I just had it cut out on me entirely and then restart. Which is not YouTube's fault at all. It's just the reality of I've got a wonky internet connection at the moment. I'm going to see how the internet connection is over the next week. I may wind up pre-recording. I'll have an episode up on Sunday, either pre-recorded or live if the internet starts cooperating again. But until Sunday, and I should have... I'm not promising because things come up, but I should have at least one or two more shorter episodes this week doing the story of Sun Wukong and the Handsome Monkey King, and maybe finally getting in on starting to read the tragical history of Dr. Faustus. But until then, everyone, I want to thank you all for watching. Please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share it with your friends. I'm starting to get these requests, so let me say now, if you need to reach me because you have a paranormal situation, yes, I do investigations. You can message me through privately through the stream, or you can email me at kevinm.paranormalencyclopedia@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook at Delaware Valley Demonology Research or the Paranormal Encyclopedia. Make sure to put the "the" in so you get the right one. I'll be happy to help, or if I'm too far away to direct you to the sort of person you need, or I'll find somebody who can help you if you live too far from me, since I live in New Jersey. But until then, that's it for tonight. Thanks everybody for watching, and have a great night.